Welcome everyone and happy International Women's Day. Today we celebrate globally the social, economic and cultural and political achievements of women. The day also marks a call to action for accelerating gender parity. So we're going to hear from Dr. Sarah Marsden, and her talk is called Remembering Resistance, Protest, Power and Resistance in Women's Activism. And women have fought for change for centuries. At home, in the workplaces, in cities, towns and villages. Some of their stories are well known, but many are not. The role of the places and spaces where women have campaigned are also often overlooked, and this is important because places matter. Sarah is going to share with us some of the stories of women activists collected through Remembering Resistance, which is a programme of research, events and collaborations which examines the relationships between protest, power and place in women's activism. And these stories reveal that when women mobilise, they can change what places mean, how they're experienced and how they're used, and also illustrate how places can change people and how together they have the potential to bring about real political and social change. So Dr. Sarah Marsden is a senior lecturer in the Handa Centre for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St Andrews. She joined us in 2021 from Lancaster University. Her work looks at different kinds of political contention, and her current research focuses on counter-extremism for the Centre for Research and Evidence on Security Threats and Remembering Resistance, which is the programme of research we'll hear a bit about today. I'm going to hand over to Sarah. She will do her talk and then afterwards we'll take questions and look forward to it. Now over to you, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Tanya, and welcome everybody. It's really good to be here. I don't need an excuse to talk about the research that we did through Remembering Resistance, so it's a real pleasure to join you. So as Tanya said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we did through Remembering Resistance. It's still an ongoing programme. So I'm going to talk about one particular aspect of the work that we've done so far. And this was a project that was funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. And it looked at women's history of activism, particularly in the north of England. And the time period that we looked at was the century following the Representation of the People's Act, which in 1918 gave all men and some women in the UK the chance to vote for the first time. Before I do any of that, I really do want to do some thank yous though, because there is a much wider team that sits behind this project. So Chris Boyko, Corinna Penniston-Bird, Claire Selby, all based at Lancaster still, which, as Tanya mentioned, was where I worked before I came to St Andrews and where we started this project actually. But alongside my colleagues, there's also a much wider community of volunteers, of community groups, of arts and heritage organisations, all of whom have supported the project, as well as obviously lots of academics whose research that we've drawn on. So although I'm doing the talking, that wider community have really underpinned the project over the last 5 years. So I'm going to try and do their contributions justice. Before I dive into what we did and what we found, I'm going to introduce you to the genesis of the project and explain why it's particularly important to me. So as Tanya explained, my research looks at different kinds of political contention. So that includes protest, activism, violent resistance, but also non-violent resistance and everyday forms of resistance. And that typically involves me looking at different kinds of movements that and to try and really understand the process and the outcome of different campaigns. Now, most of those campaigns I don't have lived experience of, but in around sort of 2016, 2017, I began to wonder whether the communities and spaces that I knew best had histories of activism which might be interesting to explore. Now, I grew up in South Yorkshire, which is an area that's characterised, in the past at least, by coal mining. It was a very industrial area, and that industry of coal mining was the one that most of my family had worked in. But it also had a very rich history and a very long history of industrial disputes, of strikes, of trade unionism. So to understand better those dynamics, I did what all researchers do. I asked my dad. So particularly, I asked my dad whether there was anybody left in the village where I grew up and where my dad had also grown up, who could tell me about what women had done, particularly in the miners' strike. So for those that might not remember it, the miners' strike was a major industrial dispute. It took place in the 1980s and 90s, and it was a dispute that sought to try and stop the closure of the pits in the north of England in particular, but not exclusively. And so I asked my dad, you know, who's in the village, who can I talk to about this? And he, after giving it some thought, said there really wasn't anybody left. They'd either died or they'd moved away, and with them that kind of community memory and the history of their activism had gone with them. And in many ways, Remembering Resistance is dedicated to putting that right. So its aim is to really, primarily, to conserve that aspect of our history so that our generation, future generations can learn about how women who might genuinely be otherwise forgotten pursued political change. And we wanted to do that in a way which really engaged people with those stories so that we could hopefully allow people within those communities space to encounter those stories, to learn about the ideas that inspired women to protest, but also to ensure that those regional voices weren't lost, so that they were captured and so that we could understand them and understand the impact that they had on their communities, but also the way that their communities shaped their activism. And as Tanya kind of hinted at, we took a particular approach to pursuing those aims. And that approach was to focus really heavily on the role of place and space in shaping the history and the experience of women's activism. And by place and space, I mean both the sort of physical settings, so the particular material environment that people live in, but also the meanings that they hold. So you can imagine places where you've lived and worked aren't just physical buildings, they're not just streets, they have meaning because they have histories and memories which you hold about them. So you might ask, well, why place? Why do we need to think about place? Well, places do lots of different things. At the regional level, at the national level, they provide a sense of identity. But they also carry particular social and political histories, and those histories create the context for political activism. So as I mentioned, in the north, there was a really strong tradition of trade unionism. The labour movement also had a really strong presence there. But communities are also rooted in spaces with particular industrial or economic histories, and those shape identities and they bind people together around shared stories, which often attach particular meanings to certain towns, to certain villages, squares, and even streets. So in that way, they're a really, really important part of social life, and they're a dynamic of social and historical change. They're interpreted, we narrate them, they're imagined by people who live in and pass through them. So in other words, they hold meaning and they shape people's experiences, but they also, and this is really important for activism, reflect ideas about who's got the right to be in certain kinds of places. What can people and should people realistically do in certain places? So we wanted to understand those processes from the perspective of women who tried to bring about change. And to do that by looking at a region which had been largely, not completely, but largely overlooked by academics. So why the north of England, you might ask next. So you might have guessed, I've got a vested interest, obviously, in looking at women's activism in the north because of my own biography, but it's not just that. We were also responding to the fact that a disproportionate amount of attention had been paid to women's protest and activism in large cities, but particularly in London and the South East. And that focus often neglected how wider movements, so for instance, the women's liberation movement, played out in different regional contexts. And we were also aware that historically, the north of England is pretty significant for women and activism, not least because the suffrage movements which fought for women's right to vote had their genesis there, in Manchester in particular. So that mobilisation, the suffrage movement, reflected both the space that women fought to carve out for themselves, but also created the context for future generations of women to engage in politics in the region. It was also a region that was marked by particular configurations of class, of ethnicity, of regional identities, which in turn were shaped by histories of employment, migration, industrialisation and deindustrialisation. So we felt there was a really rich ground to mine to try and contextualise how women had engaged in activism and protest, both in the past, but also into the present. So with all that in mind, we wanted to find out what we could learn if we foregrounded those regional perspectives, and with the aim to preserve and interpret those experiences for future generations of researchers, of activists perhaps, but also of community members who might find knowledge, perhaps might even find wisdom in those stories. So what did we do? Well, we took that 100-year period, which followed the Representation of the People's Act in 1918, and of course found, and as you imagined, that women have been involved in a huge range of protest movements, for campaigning from the suffragettes right through to the Me Too movement and all the campaigns that continue today. Now, of course, over that time, there have been some really significant changes in women's rights, in the opportunities that women have. There is, of course, much more to do as well. So our aim was to understand those stories through the voices of women who've been involved in pursuing change, and to look at the full range of ways that women had tried to bring about social and political shifts. And that included everything from kind of small scale acts of everyday resistance in the home, in the street, to right through to larger mobilisations, to marches, to movements that in some cases could last decades. So our focus, as you can imagine, was pretty wide. And the other thing to say is that we were concerned both with women's movements, so that's movements that tried to foreground and promote women's issues, but also the experience of women in movements, different kinds of movements, whether that was the environment movement, whether that was pension disputes and so on. So together, that approach really tried to understand the relationships between protest, power and place. And in doing that, what we wanted to understand was how protest changes people, but also how people and protest change places. So what did we do? Well, as I said, we wanted the project to be developed with people from the region. And so we also wanted to share what we were finding with those communities, the communities that many of these women lived in and in some cases are still based in. So to do that, we worked with an amazing group of volunteer citizen researchers, and through and with those volunteers, we gathered the stories of women who've been involved in protest. So we trained our volunteers in oral history methods, and we provided support, really with the aim of trying to enable them and us to encounter the region's history of women's protest by recording the memories and the oral histories of over 100 women activists. As well as that, we created a permanent archive of women's history of protest in the North. There's a virtual museum, which you can reach on our website. There are case studies of movements and campaigns. We catalogued over 600 protest events over that 100-year period. And we mapped the routes and the sites of protest over that time. And we also, which was a real highlight, organised loads and loads of events. We went all over the north of England, trying to create space for people to come together and share their experiences. And all of that culminated in an exhibition at Sheffield Museums in 2019, just before the pandemic disrupted our work, our lives, and indeed the project. And I'm really, really pleased to be able to take some time to share some of the stories of the women and the campaigns that make up the project. But to put those stories in context, it's worth talking briefly about how we perhaps normally think about women's activism over the last 100 years. And that's very often described in relation to waves of feminism. And they all had slightly different aims, and they also had different types of tactics and strategies. So the first generation of feminists perhaps started in the sort of early to mid 1800s, and they were primarily concerned with securing the right to vote, but also securing education rights for women and property rights. So they campaigned, they carried out marches and demonstrations, and sometimes they engaged in direct action. There was one particular story of a group of suffragettes who in St Andrews went and dug up parts of the old course to draw attention to their cause, and you can imagine just how popular they would have been at the time. With the securing the right to vote, and also with obviously the First and Second World Wars, those sort of waves died down somewhat, and the second wave of feminists emerged in the 1960s. They had different ambitions. We had the right to vote by that point, but we didn't have rights and legislation protecting equal pay for equal work, equal education and employment opportunities. They also campaigned for free childcare, contraception, abortion rights. And they used some of the same tactics as the generation before them, but they also really focused on trying to raise women's consciousness, as they put it, so that women became better versed in the sorts of inequalities that they experienced. So they set up thousands of groups all over the country, and this was an international movement, so it went beyond our borders. And those groups, as I say, sought to raise women's consciousness about their experiences of women and why the personal was political. More recently, third generation feminism emerged, which is more often organised around particular issues. So it might be street harassment, it could be sexual violence, media portrayals of women. And this is characterised by, ideally, a more inclusive and diverse community. Second generation feminists were criticised, and there was tension within the movement at the time for neglecting the experiences of women of colour. and for being primarily a middle class movement. So there were lots of dynamics that were not represented as well there. And the third generation feminists are alert to those sensitivities. So they typically try and reflect a more diverse community, and they focus on everyday experiences as well as broader legal challenges. And those features are reflected in their approach. It's often more culturally oriented, it's reflected in music, in style, in identity, and different representations of identity, as well as sort of protest campaigning and activism. Now, those three waves of feminism are a really important part of the story. But when we looked at our data that we were collecting, it was complicated. And the sort of record of women's activism that we captured demonstrated that they were involved in a huge array of campaigns. So this image that you can see here is just a snapshot from the timeline that we developed over the 100 years period. And each of those bars, each of those coloured bars, represents a protest movement or a campaign. The colours represent different types of campaigns, whether that's the peace movement, the environment movement, poverty campaigning, LGBTQ+ rights, pensions, and so on. And then the width of the bars indicates how long it went on for. So as you can see, the story of women's activism is much more deep and much broader than just those waves of feminism that we typically encounter. So if there are three things really that I'd invite you to take away from today is, first of all, it's the breadth and depth of women-led campaigns. All of these campaigns were led by women. Very often they focused on things which were sort of particular campaigns like poverty, like pensions and so on, but they did so with a feminist sensibility. But also to take away the fact that activism comes in a whole variety of forms, and I'm going to introduce you to some of those in a minute. But also the ways in which sort of people's experiences and the processes and outcomes of women's activism are really informed in important ways by the places and spaces where they occur. So I'm going to introduce you to some of those women and the campaigns that we encountered through the project. Some you'll know, others might be new to you, but hopefully they illustrate how women have changed their relationship to power over the last century, and how in doing so, women have not just challenged specific injustices, but they've done that whilst also challenging ideas about women's role in politics and confronting assumptions about the kinds of places and spaces women have got the right to occupy. So the first person I'm going to introduce you to is Florence White. Florence is fourth from the right in this image. And she was born into a working class family in Bradford in 1886. And she was a pretty clever girl when she was a child. But she left school, as many others did, at 12 to work in the mill before she set up a dressmaking business with her sister. Now, Florence got engaged in 1916, but her fiancé Albert died during fighting during France. And so she never married. And she remained unmarried for the rest of her life. But she did become involved in politics. And in 1935, she set up the National Spinsters Pensions Association, the NSPA. And their aim was to make politicians spinster conscious. And what the NSPA wanted was to challenge the pension age for unmarried women. So they wanted it to be lowered from 65 to 55. And the reason they gave was that many spinsters suffered poor health. And they often really struggled to find work later in life. And that meant that in many cases, they didn't even live to state pension age, so they couldn't draw down the pension that they paid into. But as well as those political aims, the movement also challenged the stereotype of spinsters as being sort of pitiful or marginalised. And instead, they organised a pretty confident and energetic campaign. They organised marches, rallies, petitions. One of those petitions attracted 1 million signatures. And the NSPA at its height had 150,000 members. Now imagine that back in the 1930s and 1940s. That's quite a feat. Organising was done by letter and in small group meetings. And they were also pretty creative. At one point they invited Neville Chamberlain, who was then the British Prime Minister, to a meeting. And they presented him with an umbrella for his 70th birthday. But they gave a caution with that umbrella, that he should also ensure that spinsters were protected for a rainy day. And that campaign had some success. In January 1950, the age at which single women could retire was lowered from 65 to 60. Florence died in 1961, but her legacy lives on. She's commemorated in a plaque outside the Bradford Mechanics Institute, which is where the NSPA first held their meeting, as well as in a rhyme by a young supporter of Florence Wright, who said, "God made each maid a husband, but men on earth must fight. So just in case there aren't enough, he made Miss Florence White." And what that campaign shows is that women pursued the right to be political in public spaces, and they challenged perceptions about whether they should be there through creative and sometimes ironic and funny approaches. And they aimed to demonstrate their political aims, but also challenge the idea that they were weaker, that they weren't suited to politics. And in that way, they asserted their right to be taken seriously in the public sphere. Women also travelled to power to confront it. So when the sites of power and decision making were far away from their communities, some decided to seek it out by travelling, often on foot, to power, typically in London. And that approach is reflected in what's quite a significant history of women marching to London from all over the country. They did it in the suffrage pilgrimage in 1913. They did it in the Peacemakers pilgrimage in 1926. They also did it in the context of the Hunger Marches. So the Hunger Marches were a feature of the Great Depression, and they were typically organised by the National Union of Unemployed Workers, and they marched from all areas of the country, typically from areas of considerable deprivation, to London. And there was a women's contingent, and it was led by Maud Brown, who in 1932 started in Burnley, which is a small town, now not so small, based up in the northwest of England. And they walked for hundreds of miles through Yorkshire, Derbyshire, Leicestershire, and down to London. And when they arrived in London, the marchers presented a petition of over 1 million signatures, which they collected along the way, which actually the Prime Minister refused to accept. But that was really very hard. They were breaking all sorts of taboos, stereotypes, assumptions about what women should be doing, and certainly what women should be doing without men. And Maud explained some of the hardships that they faced. They were harried by police, by workhouse staff. But they did have some hard-won success. They encouraged the fight against the means test. They resisted efforts to force single women into domestic service. And Maud gave a warning that those women who are young now must not fail to remember that what has been won can and has to be kept. So those women claimed the right to march hundreds of miles to make their voices heard in really concrete and visible ways. And they confronted power in its own backyard. And in that way, they challenged assumptions about what was appropriate behaviour, about what appropriate concerns for women were. And that, and the campaign of Florence White, has got real echoes of contemporary campaigns, and that's something that we've sort of noted throughout. There is a remarkable similarity in the issues which keep emerging. Maud Brown campaigned for equal pay, for creches to enable women to work. Florence campaigned for fairer pensions for women. All of those are still campaigns that are going on in different kinds of forms today. But one question that we were intrigued by is, where do women, despite these barriers and challenges, get their energy from? Where do they get their power from? And one place that drives women's activism is the communities that they are part of. And that is perhaps nowhere more obvious than in the Women Against Pit Closures movement. And they were very active both in the 1984-5 strike, but also in the 92-3 strike. And they came together, of course, to support their men who were out on strike, trying to really defend the pits against closure. But they were also, alongside that, there to defend their communities, and they wished to protect the places and the people that they cared about. So one woman said at the time, "We're proud of the determination and courage of our men. We support them wholeheartedly. We've seen the horrors of mass unemployment cripple other industries. We've witnessed the slow death of communities dependent on them and the tragedies that fall on families and individuals." And it was very often the desire to defend those communities that gave them the motivation to come together. And there was a shared sense of collective identity rooted in those communities that enabled them to draw together the support, the power to sustain what was a really long and really difficult campaign. Now, it's worth saying I'm not one for romanticising what was a really difficult period for the mining communities and for those women, nor actually of romanticising what was a really dangerous and difficult industry. And it's also important to say that not just in this campaign, but right across the piece, women had very different experiences within them. For some, in the Women Against Pit Closures movement, for example, it was part of their sort of political life. They were involved in an ongoing basis in political campaigning. But for others, it was the very first time they'd ever been involved in anything like it. And it's fair to say that the oral histories really draw attention to the impact it had on many of the women who were involved. And in many cases, it changed the way that women saw themselves. As one said, the thing about the miners' strike was that it brought people together in a way they'd forgotten before the strike. Only this time there was a difference, because women saw things that made them realise they didn't have to go back to the kitchen sink. And that raises another really interesting question. It's like, well, what do these campaigns achieve, and how might we think about those achievements? Now, for the Women Against Pit Closures movement, they lost. The pits were closed, the communities were decimated. But a wide range of other things flowed from that campaign. For some, it led to a deeper involvement in politics, a greater awareness, a greater confidence in their abilities, but also a reluctance in some cases to go back to these sort of perceived designated gender roles. And in some cases, it led to really concrete outcomes, community learning centres, community organisations, some of which continue today to provide support and services for those communities. So although protest and campaigning doesn't always succeed, it can still be transformative on a personal and to some degree on a political level. As one woman said, the strike was the best 12 months of my life. We were women and we'd never done it out like that before. It changed everything. It changed what women could do. That campaign was very visible. It was very public. But not all types of activism are as visible as that, and not all of them relate to public sites of resistance in the ways that I've just described. Women have also been engaged in activism in relation to the home environment, and that includes the experiences of women that are shaped by intersections of ethnicity, of religion, and of class, where women of colour can face layers of discrimination, of racism, of sexism, of economic disadvantage that place additional barriers in the way of that impetus to exert political agency. And one example of a group that was working in that context was the West Yorkshire Home Working Group. And they worked with primarily South Asian women to raise awareness and improve their working conditions. Now, these women were home workers, often in the textile industry, and they were paid on a piecemeal basis, bit by bit, to sew items of clothing, to knit, to pack boxes. And that was a working practice that really reached its peak probably in the 1980s. The hours were really long, the pay was really poor, and they had very few rights, and they were pretty vulnerable to being exploited. And they also typically combined that paid work with childcare, with house care work, and that created a real burden, which was almost exclusively borne by women. But they also exerted agency. They tried in different kinds of ways to resist the efforts of their employers to exploit them. And that included the efforts of activist groups like the West Yorkshire Home Working Group, who fought for legislative change. They fought for efforts to try and improve pay and working conditions. They lobbied for better employment rights. And that campaign was concerned particularly with supporting self-organisation. And it recognised the importance of working with, but also listening to home workers, instead of imposing ideas about how and what kind of change was needed, not least as those needs differed across communities and contexts. Now, that home working group and the women that they engaged with had to navigate linguistic and cultural dynamics, as well as structural issues like a lack of childcare, like the pressure that large firms put on smaller producers to cut costs. And they were informed by processes that went far beyond West Yorkshire. So their approach was, in the words of Jan Tate, who helped set up the working group, the home working group, to develop a campaign in which the personal interconnects with the political, the family situation with work, lobbying Parliament with small local meetings, to build unity across classes in a way which brings out the strength of women, more often in small groups with a less formal structure and organisation than in a union, and which recognises the impact of sexism and racism in the home worker experience. So that campaign illustrates that the home can also be a site of resistance, from the ways in which women organise their time to disrupt exploitative working practices, and the ways networks of support and solidarity were created, often in the living rooms and the kitchens of women who wanted things to change, but which then, as now, have to navigate intersectional dynamics of discrimination and economic disadvantage. So in my final group of women that I want to share with you, I want to draw attention to the fact that as well as those public spaces, those protests, those marches, and those private spaces, activism can also create new sites for solidarity by creating new physical sites of protest. So one example, the one I'm going to share with you now, is in the context of an anti-fracking campaign at Preston New Road near Blackpool, again in the north of England. So since 2014, a group of people, mainly women, have been campaigning against fracking, which is an energy extraction process whereby rocks, shale gas are exploded in order to extract the gas in them. And when they heard about this practice, which environmentalists have drawn significant concerns about, they wanted to do something about it. And they got off to a pretty impressive start. So they'd heard that heavy machinery was about to start test drilling in this greenfield site. And so they hatched a plan to stop them. And a group of around 20 women, all ages, came together in the middle of the night and got a taxi out to the field where the testing was going to be carried out. And with them, they brought trestle tables and cake and tea and bunting, and they were dressed as Lancashire nanas, which is what you can see in this image here. For those that don't know Lancashire nanas, they are grandmas who wear yellow tabards and headscarves as icons of their identity. So the first thing that the contractors saw when they arrived on site that morning was a group of middle-aged to elderly women having tea and cake in the field that they thought they were going to start drilling in. And they went on to occupy that field for 3 weeks. And that started a campaign that went on for over 2 years, and which until, well, no, longer than that actually, and which until quite recently they seem to have won. There have been some changes which mean that the fracking may now start again. Now that campaign got really messy, it got very complicated, there were arrests, and at times people got hurt. And the women responded to that with different kinds of creative tactics. They knitted a lot. They knitted huge banners that they strung across local hedgerows. They set up a camp about half a mile down the road at Maple Tree Farm, which was actually the car park of a garden centre. And that protest site emerged from these women and their activism. They started a samba band, they learned to dance, but they also, most powerfully of all perhaps, tried to find ways to respond to the distress and the difficulty that were caused by confrontations, particularly between the police and the protesters. So in response to that, it's a weekly walk. They set up a weekly walk for calm. So they dressed all in white to echo the suffragettes who did the same. And every week on a Wednesday afternoon, the women walked slowly from Maple Tree Farm about half a mile up to the gates of the site, and they stood to bear witness in silence to the threat that to their communities and the environment that they believed fracking posed, and also to remind themselves about what the campaign was really for. Now, few of those women knew each other before they started campaigning, and many of them had never been involved in politics or activism before. Some of them were really suspicious of that first group of women who turned up with their trestle tables and their tabards and their cake. They thought they were troublemakers, they thought they were crusties, but they also, that initial group, recognised the need to build trust. So the women who led the campaign baked cakes. They invited people in to talk to them about what was happening, and by and large they won people over. So that site at Maple Tree Farm became an entirely new site for connection, for solidarity, and ultimately for community. It wasn't always easy. There were obstacles and there were challenges, but the women, and some of whom were in their 80s, have come together to oppose something that they felt would damage their community. And as one woman that we spoke to said when describing that walk for calm, it's a different sort of protest, in the sense it's about mothers and carers and grandmothers mainly. It's about the future generation. So the way it feels different to me is it's almost like we're mothers and grandmothers standing up for our children's future. That's the bottom line. It's a time for reflection and for calm. And it's to show that women are gentle. We're not troublemakers. We're not professional activists. We're not swampies and tree huggers. We're just ordinary women who feel strongly and passionately that this is wrong. So hopefully those stories, and there are only a few out of the hundreds that we were fortunate enough to encounter through the project, illustrate that when women mobilise, they can change places by challenging who's got the right to use them, what happens in them, what they mean, and how they're experienced. But they can also change people by nurturing new identities and networks of change which enable women to see themselves in different kinds of ways. And in some cases, through that process, they are able to bring about real political, legal and social change. They challenge laws, they challenge stereotypes and expectations. And they're part of a canon of women who sometimes noisily and rowdily, sometimes quietly and gently, and sometimes imperfectly, have done what they can to make the places and spaces that they care about better. So hopefully that's given you a flavour of some of the stories that we collected, and I really welcome your questions and your thoughts about these women or about the women that you know. So I'll hand back to Tanya for questions. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you so much. That was really so interesting. You've talked a lot about the different campaigns. I'd be just really interested to know which one really stands out for you and why.
it's a little bit like sort of choosing between your favourite children or your favourite creature animals. There are a huge number of really, really important campaigns that we looked at. I think one that really, really strikes me as just, it really, really stands out in my mind, was a campaign by women in Durham who were teaching assistants, and in the mid-2010s rather, they the local council wanted to change their contracts, and that for some was going to reduce their pay by about 25%, and it was just unsustainable for those women. And they were, you know, in some cases going to lose their homes. They were really in desperate straits, so they came together and they mobilised. Now, what was really interesting about their campaign was that it was based in a region which had a huge history of trade unionism, of labour activism, and particularly around the mines. And one of the features of Durham is that every year, pandemics notwithstanding, they have something called the Durham Miners Gala, and this is one of the largest festivals of working class life, of sort of trade unionism, and it attracts people from all over the world who march through the town. They stop the town in its tracks, and they've all got banners. Now, women have been typically less well represented in that space. It's been going on since the 1800s. And so the women wanted to raise, you know, awareness about their campaign. So they spoke to people, particularly the guy who ran the Durham Miners Hall, which was the place where the miners' union was based, and said, "What do we do?" And he said, "Well, why don't you come to the Miners' Gala?" And the woman who was organising it, an amazing activist called Laura Turnbull, said, "Oh, but I've been going to the gala since I was a kid, but I don't know what to do. I mean, what do I do?" And he said, you get to the dance, you get to the you know, the meeting point, and you see a band, and you just feed in, lasses, just feed in. And it was so powerful, and it still brings a lump to my throat. It was so powerful because it was accepting women into a tradition of male-dominated activism. It was physically bringing women into that fold and supporting them. And the way that, you know, Lisa talks about that that parade, she just sobbed the entire way through because the whole town was behind them. And so that space and that history of activism is one which really, really stands out as one that, just as I say, and as you can see, really gets to me because it's so powerful as a story about histories and about women's involvement in activism in certain places.
Thank you. So you mentioned you worked with volunteers and activists and arts organisations. Could you tell us a bit more about the process of doing that project, how you worked with all the different types of people?
It was such a joy, honestly. It was the volunteers that we worked with were amazing. They were women from all sorts of backgrounds. Some of them were activists, some of them weren't, and their involvement in the project was really, really central to its success, but also to what we wanted to do, because we wanted women, and including in that myself and, you know, the research team, to really encounter our own histories. And so working with the volunteers was seminal, really. And I think what was really powerful was the impact that it had on them. So, you know, they reported back to us, and we, you know, we're still in touch, and they still explain the impact of hearing the voices of those women and understanding more about the histories of the places where they live. And, you know, that kind of the rewarding nature of sort of meeting these women who've been involved in activism over the years was really seminal for them. And it was wonderful to see some of them set up their own projects. So they went on to get funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund themselves. We went out and, as I said, we did sort of lots of talks, and we did lots of engagement activities with different communities, and learning with and engaging with those community activist groups was also really important. They helped us understand how messy, how complicated, how simplistic often academic readings of these movements are. And, you know, and I worry about that sometimes when we present the findings, that it evens out a lot of complexities, a lot of tensions and a lot of difficulties. So working really closely with those women also was just a constant reminder of honouring those stories, because they're not stories, they're women's lives. And, you know, these women were not, then in Yorkshire they would say they're not backed in coming forward, so they're not shy about coming forward and explaining, you know, what they did, but also protecting that story. And we kind of hold it in trust. So we changed the language that we used. We talked initially about kind of capturing stories. We don't talk about that really now. We talk about holding them in trust for others. and trying all the time for us to be sensitive to those dynamics, because as I say, they aren't stories, they're women's lives and histories. So working with those volunteers, working with the community organisations, working with the activist groups and learning from them was just incredibly important in grounding us and also teaching us. And we learnt, every single time we had a conversation with people. And we always hope to go back to those people and those communities as we continue to develop the project.
And is that what you wanted to achieve through the project, sort of holding those individual stories for women of the future? Or what else did you want to achieve through the project?
I mean, that was a really important part of it. What I sort of had this image in my mind that if each of us went and gathered 20 stories, talk to women in our streets, talk to our families, that those 20 women could also be encouraged to go and talk to 20 women more, and that this ripple effect could actually galvanise women and recognise the scope of their contributions. Because what was really, really powerful, and what came through every single time we did any of the events that we talked to women, women would come along and they'd sort of say, yeah, this is really interesting, and then we'd ask them, if you've done anything, and they'd all say, almost to the last person, oh, I didn't do anything really. And then they would go on to tell you these absolutely amazing stories of genuine courage, in workplaces, home, in the streets. And you'd say, well, just come and tell us a bit more. Do you want to record that story? Oh, no, I couldn't do that. And I think that, for lots of reasons, that means that we miss those stories and also those everyday experiences, which are actually really important. Women holding the line in work, women holding the line at home. And so what I wanted to do, what we kind of were committed to doing, was honouring that and to shed a light on it and to help women, consider all of us as part of that, as a part of a much broader story. And what was really powerful when we had the exhibition was inviting all of those activists that we interviewed along and seeing their reaction to seeing their campaigns going, as part of this much longer story.
Yeah.
And it gave them huge, the feedback that they shared with us was the galvanizing power of seeing how women over time and in community have brought about change, notwithstanding the difficulties, the challenges, the tensions, the arguments, the fights, but knowing that that was part of the story that we are going to lose if we don't honour it and really seek it out, I think. So that's what I hope for from the project, and to really invite people to ask the questions of grandmothers, of sisters, of aunts, of mums. What did you do and why? Because I'm sure that we would all uncover stories that we don't know, because women often don't come forward in the way that we might otherwise.
So, Sarah, quite a few questions to get through and not that much time. So, Sunil Rogers says, fantastic talk, really interesting analytical themes. But in light of the recent passing of prominent disabled activist Judy Newman, wonder if you have any examples of different forms of activism by disabled women in your project?
I'll be honest and I'll say I don't think we do. And I think this was a real challenge that we faced in making sure that the project was as representative as it needed to be. And I think what I would say is that what we've done so far is only scratch the surface. So it's a really, really powerful reminder of making sure that women of colour, women with disabilities, women from particular minority communities, right, in the broadest sense of the word, are represented in the work that we did. And I think it's fair to say that we didn't succeed in that fully, and we were really mindful of it. And I think it was, again, the learning that we took from that and that we've taken forward is that we need to broaden the community of people that we engage with and be really intentional about that, so that we can engage with and learn from women of all backgrounds and experiences. So I think we have, and it was, when we did the evaluation, it was one of the things that we really drew attention to, that we weren't as representative as we would have wanted to be. And there are sort of practical reasons for that, but it doesn't, sort of take away from the point that we need to be intentionally more as alert to those dynamics. So it's a really good reminder. Thank you, Sunil.
And an anonymous one, someone saying, great presentation, proud of the women of the Northwest. I live between Preston and Burnley, and I'm hoping that nurses currently fighting for change have the impact of some of the women in your stories. So I thought that was very nice. Another one, which spaces of protest surprised you?
I think some of the what was really striking was sort of looking at the past from the position that we take now. So that the marches that women did, particularly from the north into London, were remarkable in the way that they carried out that campaign, because they were really challenging so many different assumptions about what women did and what women could and should do. So I was really struck by the lengths that they had to go to in order to do that, and the way that they kind of claimed that space. The craftivists were also really, really interesting. So the knitters, I talked about them in relation to Preston New Road and the anti-fracking campaign, but there was also Wool Against Weapons, and they knitted this huge, kind of scarf, basically, which was the length of a nuclear reactor, and showed, kind of quite clearly where, how, sort of significant these sorts of weapons were. And so the sort of creative ways of bringing sort of forms of activism into public spaces was also really, really interesting. So the way that people disrupted, or the way that women disrupted expectations about what spaces should be used for and how they worked, were also really, really interesting. So it was about I think the things that really struck me were when women were claiming spaces which they just had never had before, and also the way that they kind of creatively challenged how spaces are typically used.
Yeah.
So yeah, they were some of the ones that I was struck by.
So linked to that, Kate says you mentioned Nana's embracing the identity, knitting and all, and she wonders about the uses and meanings of motherhood and the ideas, positive and negative, around motherhood in women's activism.
It's central, and I think it's central for lots of different reasons, not least because childcare issues, they run right through all of this. And so the sort of the identity of being a mother informed a lot of that activism, because they needed, those in power to grant and afford them the opportunity to work. And also, as that last campaign that I talked about, environmental feminist activists often talk in terms of intergenerational processes. So they think about their grandmothers, they think about their children and their grandchildren, and that is how they sort of motivate. That's how they are motivated, I think, in many kinds of ways. And again, women have done some really sort of striking things. There was a campaign in Liverpool, it was about rent strikes, and all the women just gathered up their babies and they stormed the council building and said, well, what are you going to help? We can't work, and if we can't, because you can't give us childcare, and if we can't work, then we can't pay the rents that you've just increased. So they were, performing motherhood, if you like, in that way, because they had no other choice but to confront those who were creating difficulties for them with the consequences of motherhood, not, that the council leaders were just ignoring at the time. I don't think that they were particularly successful with that particular campaign, but in almost every sense, kind of reproductive rights and motherhood and that the identity that comes with that is sort of echoed across the different campaigns, particularly obviously the ones that are more focused on women's issues, but not just those. As I mentioned, the environmental movement thinks about it in comparable ways.
So related but different, Alison asks, was there an average age at which women took part, and did parental, i.e. their own mothers' involvement, promote them or hinder them from taking part? It's quite interesting.
They're really good questions. So there is no one story. In some cases, you can sort of think about women of colour who's so thinking about that, the West Yorkshire home working group, some of the women who were sort of in their teens or perhaps early 20s really wanted to be involved, but their families and their mothers were not keen on them doing that. So there were certainly some mothers who were not fond of promoting their daughters' involvement, but in many cases there are intergenerational dynamics at work, and you do see mothers of activists bringing kids along. They will bring their children. They will, as one woman sort of said, I'll teach you which side's right and which side's wrong. And they'll teach you, kind of who your enemies are, in a sense, I think was the actual quote. So there's definitely those intergenerational processes. In terms of the ages, what was, again, really, really striking was the number of campaigns that women were involved in over their lifetimes. So we spoke to women of all ages, but those who were sort of in their middle ages and on, talked about being involved in many different campaigns over the years. So, you know, it might be peace activism in the 1960s, it might be the environmental movement in the, you know, in the current time, and all the way through there's this commitment to kind of women's rights. So what you see again is this sort of ebb and flow of women's engagement, often determined again by their personal circumstances. So they have children, it makes it harder for them to engage in activism. They have work responsibilities, home responsibilities, and so on. So there wasn't an average age, I wouldn't say, but there was certainly intergenerational kind of dynamics at work, but also that process where women continued to just keep campaigning because it was part of who they were, part of their identity, and they saw similar issues about fairness and about justice reflected in different kinds of campaigns.
There's a question about, obviously you talked about your focus on the north of England as where you come from and that focus, and Pam asks, do you also look at trends in Scotland? She mentions the women's aid movement in Scotland, which has meant ongoing activism with the practical provision of refuges being sustaining. So
I would love to, but we haven't, is the short answer to that. Scotland has a really proud tradition of women and involved in politics and women activism, but we just haven't looked at it. We are continuing to try and, well, we are persisting, we're continuing with the project, and we would love to expand it. So when I came to St Andrews from Lancaster, that was one of the first things that we started thinking about, was how do we sort of create that space for the project in Scotland. So we would love to do that. And if you know any generous donors who would like to fund that research, that would be absolutely magnificent too, because I think there's some really, really interesting dynamics again about some things which might be comparable. So we, you know, you can think about the industrial histories of Glasgow and how that might sort of have echoes, but also thinking about you know, the suffrage campaigns, looking at the Highlands and Islands, what's distinctive about those places and how they shape the potential for women's activism and protest. So we would absolutely love to do that, and hopefully we will get the chance to do so in the future.
So a couple of, I suppose, more political ones, which seems right on International Women's Day and gender parity. June says, you mentioned Maud Brown campaigning for equal pay in the 1930s. What are your thoughts about today's continued pay disparity for women?
I mean, it's a really important point, isn't it? You know, women have been campaigning for centuries, nearly, for equal pay, for equal work. And those pay gaps are stubborn. And there are lots of reasons, in inverted commas, for that, but it indicates how much further we need to go. And it also demonstrates how important not just legal changes, but social and cultural change. So you can bring in a law and say, everybody must be paid equally for the same work, but that has to be applied in practice, and that's where it's not happening. And the pace of change and the means by which that change is enabled needs more attention, because it is just not shifting. It's not shifting in the higher education sector, but it's not shifting in other spaces as well. And it's again informed by the types of work that women do. Very often women are disproportionately represented in lower paid work, and so even within an organisation, whether that's St Andrews or any other, you have this pay gap between women, often sometimes in the same role, but certainly across the piece, where the disparity is really stark. So I think what's really important is not just to draw the line and say, well, we've got the legal protection that we need now, because it demands that women then go and fight for that protection to be upheld, and also for the structural changes that are needed in order for women to secure equal pay. So that's why I say there is a lot more work to do, and it can go in so many directions: gender-based violence, equal pay, equal opportunity. So although, and
on that,
you know, go on. I could go on.
Trying to get them. Liz asks, having captured all these stories and campaigns, what were some of the key success factors that you could share with women looking to set up a campaign today?
Yeah, it's a really good question, isn't it? So I would say community and solidarity. So find your peers, be creative, and be imaginative in the way that you bring about, you draw attention to your campaign, and push from all angles. So think of it as a balloon, you're pushing from all angles, from below, so that you mobilise people in particular contexts, but also that you're able to lobby from in terms of political or sort of particular structural contexts, whether that's a work environment or whether that's a political environment. So be diverse, have as many supporters as you can possibly rally around, and be creative and imaginative in the way, in the approach that you do, and also really importantly take the long view. A lot of these campaigns were not successful, but they did other things. They created the context, as I explained, you know, for women to see themselves in political ways, which has ripple effects, you know, and so it also creates the context for the next generation. And that's why I sort of, you know, draw attention to that quote from Maud Brown, where she says, you know, what's been gained can be lost. And don't assume that just because we've got a legal change, or that, you know, there's been some shift, that is sustainable. It has to be maintained. So it's not just about, you know, pursuing political change or social change. It's also about holding the line against efforts to try and sort of tow it back. So I think, think about it in the long term, think about it often in terms of generations, be creative, build networks of solidarity and trust, and you know, abide by your values and be as creative as you can.
Lovely. And another, thanks for a fascinating presentation, Arthur says. My question is how women's identities within protest movements have changed, and is place less important contemporarily?
Super interesting. So women's identities within movements are multiple, just as they are in our everyday lives. We are, you know, we are mothers and sisters and, you know, bosses and you know, kind of servants. We have multiple identities. I think in terms of the identities that seem to be to resonate most through the project, I think that there's a greater understanding of the need for intersectionality, for diversity, for a recognition of that diversity, and a greater awareness of where the kind of the barriers lie, or where the sort of the exclusions lie within certain campaigns, and that all of that really is important work that needs to continue. That's, you know, it's around ethnicity, it's around disability, it's around class. And so those identities, I think people still need to be really alert to within those movements, because they cause all sorts of problems, and they can, you know, they can lead to infighting when you should be sort of looking outward. And the second question about whether the role of place has changed.
Yeah,
it's a really interesting one. I still think that sort of regional identities are significant and matter, and certainly when we went around the north, we weren't you know, we weren't short of women who sort of were still kind of cleaved to those identities that were rooted in particular local areas. But I think that with a more transient population, basically, there is those dynamics of identity have changed over time. So, and I also think that that's represented actually in the types of movements and in the diversity within those movements. So what you can often now see are, you know, marches with, you know, multiple different campaigns around them, whether that's, you know, student loans, whether that's pensions, whether that's the environment, and all of these kind of communities sort of come together. And I think that melding of identity and place is a really interesting feature of contemporary activism. So I'll be honest, I'll take that question away, because it wasn't, you know, we still found those regional identities to be really, really salient within the project and within the women that we spoke to. But I think it is a really interesting question about how that shifts over time. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Trevor just says, have you watched BBC Scotland 3's programme series, The Women Who Changed Modern Scotland? One to look out for, perhaps. But we are drawing now to the end of the talk, and I just wanted to say thank you very much to everybody who's asked a question, and thank you very much to you, Sarah. That was really fascinating, and we all very much enjoyed it.
Thank you very much for coming along, and I hope that you've taken something away of the energy that these women have in relation to your own sort of lives and experiences, and perhaps we'll go and ask the women in your lives about what they've done. So sincere thanks for the opportunity to come and talk to you about the research.
And happy International Women's Day.
Indeed.
Goodbye.